Thank you very much. I knew he could see where we were going. Fantastic. We appreciate you, Steve. Love you to death, brother. Thank you, Jay. Thank all the fellas. We had a meeting a while ago, George and Jay and Steve and I, and appreciate these men and what they do and the efforts and the concern and the love for you as a congregation and for the Lord. It truly makes me feel good being the new guy in town. I hope that you're giving thought to, as we said this morning, what we're going to talk about for the next two Sunday mornings, two things that you absolutely need in your life. And they may not be what you're thinking, but hopefully you're thinking about those things and see if the two things that I come up with are the two things that you come up with. The story is told of a little boy that he'd been feeling his oats most of the day. His mother had just finally had enough. She'd been on him all day long. But she'd got to the breaking point, and so she took the little boy and she put him in a corner. And she told him, she said, "You sit there right now and you behave and don't do anything." As she walked off, he said, "How can I do anything? Between God and Santa Claus and you watching me, I can't get away with anything." And you know, sometimes when we read about God and we see that the Bible talks about the presence of God, we think of that in a negative light. Now, the Bible promises the presence of God. Several passages, the eyes of the Lord are in every place, keeping watch on the evil and on the good. The wise man Solomon wrote in Proverbs 15 and verse 3. Job even asked the question, like you. He says, "Does he," talking about God, "not see my ways and count all my steps?" And the answer is, well, surely he does. And on the Bible tells us, the Bible promises us, God is watching over us. That God is, to use one of those big terms, omnipresent. Just simply means he's present everywhere. And for a lot of folks, that is a promise that causes great mixed emotions and mixed feelings. To know that God is watching them, to know that God is seeing them, to know that God is present. And yet, if one thinks about it, the promise of God's presence is not a negative, it's a positive. And it is not something that should worry us or get us overly wrought, but it is something that should cause us to rejoice and to rejoice greatly. But when I make that statement, I ask myself, in making that statement and believing that it is important, or God wouldn't have told us that he is omnipresent, to ask myself, well, why is this so important to me? Is this helpful? Is it hopeful? Does it give me something to hang my hat on? And I think the answer is yes, it does. That he is watching not only over us, but when you stop and think about it, he is watching for us. He is not just simply watching to see the mistakes that we make, but because of his power, his strength, his might, his love, his mercy, his grace and concern for us, he's not just watching over me, but he's watching for me. Well, still, we ask the question, what difference does that make to me? How does that help me? Well, let's answer that in the time we have remaining this evening. I believe that it's important and it is essential for us because it helps us to understand one of the great and precious promises that the Bible gives us. And that is that God keeps us from secret sin. And God, in keeping us from secret sin, as he watches over us, is a great positive. It makes us live better lives. In Psalms chapter 19, the psalmist there in Psalm 19 and verse 12 makes the statement. He says, "Cleanse me from secret faults And then verse 13 says, keep back your servant from presumptuous sins. Let them not have dominion over me. Now, oftentimes when we look at that verse and we think of presumptuous sins, we think of sins from the standpoint of you're assuming something. You have made a presumption, and thus that's a sin. But the word there, both the word itself and within the greater context, simply means hidden sins, concealed sins, secret sins. It is true, and it is true without a doubt. We can say 100% of men, and you know you can't say that about anything, really, can you? But 100% of men commit sin. And when we commit sin, sometimes, not all the times, but sometimes we try to cover over the sin. Well, how do people try to cover up their sin? Some will deny their sin. They'll either A, deny their sin, or they'll B, deny that it is a sin. And so, plainly put, they'll say, well, you know, I don't sin. Or no, I didn't make that mistake. And so they deny their very actions. I didn't do that. I didn't do that at all. And while it is true that assumptions can be made and charges can be made, and those charges made against us may not be true, but it is still up to us to own up to the things that we do and to the wrongs that we commit. But some try to deny sin. Some try to blame others. Well, I did it, but here's the reason I did it. Some will blame their economic status, their socio-economic status. Well, this is, you know, I was raised in this condition, and therefore that's to blame. Some will blame genetics. Well, you know, I just can't help it. That's just the way I'm made. Some will blame others. Well, now I did this because they did that, and there's the reason that I did what I did. Others will try literally just to cover it over, finding other avenues and other things to simply put, bury the sin that's in their life. Yet while the Bible tells us that there were those that literally tried to hide their sin, Achan, remember in the book of Joshua, the 7th chapter, the children of Israel marched around the walls of Jericho, and remember they were to take nothing back, but he did. And it's interesting because the children of Israel went against Ai, they won, they've marched around the walls of Jericho, they were told not to take anything, Achan did, they go against Ai again. Guess what? They lose. All of a sudden there is discouragement in the camp. Joshua is upset, and he's upset with God because God has allowed them to lose, and basically God says, look, there's sin in the camp, and I told you, if there's sin in the camp, I'm not going to help you. Well, what's the problem? Well, it's Achan. And sure enough, when Achan is confronted, he tells of what he has taken, the wedge, the gold, the Babylonian garment that he has taken, and that he has hidden them in his tent. Well, whether we live our life as Achan, or we live our life as Ananias and Sapphira that tried to say that they gained a certain amount of money from the sale of their property and they gave it all to the Lord, when the reality of it was they didn't, and so thus they lied and covered up their sin. We simply need to know God sees what we do, and God knows what we do. For God, according to Ecclesiastes 12 and verse 14, will bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil. You might say, well, how does that help? Well, man, if he understands that principle, is less inclined to try to do something and get away with it, isn't he? Jerry Clower, famous comedian, famous comic, told about, a lot of things, told about the Ledbetters, told about life in Mississippi. But Jerry Clower told a story once. he told about the time in which his family was eating. And he said there were rules within the family. And one of the rules was that no one was to take the last piece of chicken. But he said one night that rule was violated. He said the meal was light. There wasn't a whole lot of things there to eat and a whole lot to choose from. And everyone was eyeing the very last drumstick that was on the plate, when all of a sudden a gust of wind came through the room in which they were eating and blew out the candle, and so it was all dark. And all of a sudden, he heard his father exclaim, "Oh!" And then someone lit the candle, and there, he said, there was my dad's hand on the drumstick, and there were 5 forks stuck in the back of his hand. Well, basically, the story, I think I use it to show, to illustrate that there really is with God no such thing as secret sin. Oh, men may not know about it in the world, but God knows about it. And so it's a comfort to us because we understand everything's above board. We understand we're not getting by with it. We move forward and we appreciate the presence of God in knowing that presence, if we are knowledgeable of it, will keep us from trying to hide and cover our sins. But then second of all, the presence of God, the fact that He watches for us tells me that He'll strengthen me in time of temptation. Well, we've already said that we'll sin, but in order to sin, there has to be temptation, right? Paul said in Romans chapter 12, verse 21, do not be overcome with evil, but overcome evil with good. Yes, the reality is that there is going to come temptation. Now, let's understand and let's remember that it's not a sin to be tempted. Jesus was tempted, Matthew chapter 4. But the Hebrew writer says he was without sin. And so it's not wrong to be tempted. It's that possibility of giving in. When we are tempted, there are several possibilities to the way we can respond to that temptation. We can be as Joseph of the Old Testament. Potiphar's wife came and tried to get him to be with her. We can flee the temptation. We can literally run from it. We can fold under it. The possibility of just giving in and giving up and saying, well, there's nothing else we could do. There's no other path that we could choose other than simply put, just to give in. We can follow the temptation. In following it, we're simply listening to what is being said. And we're following what Satan puts before us. Or we can fight. When temptation comes our way, we can fight the good fight of faith, but fight the good fight of faith against the temptation that's put before us. We need to be individuals that fight. Don't listen to Satan. Don't listen to the temptation. Yes, Satan's going to put up a good front. And Satan's going to make it all look good and look pleasurable and look enjoyable and look to be what's right. But yet, as Christians, we understand that God's watching. But that should strengthen us in the midst of our temptation. We might ask, well, how is that going to strengthen us? Well, let's listen to a couple of verses and let's put some thoughts from those verses together and we understand. Blessed is the man that endureth temptation. Why? For when he is tried, when he is approved, he will what? He will be found acceptable. He will receive the blessing from God. He will receive the crown of life. That's what James said in James chapter 1, verse 12. The man that's tried but does not give in. The man that understands that he fights the good fight. He fights it. He endures the temptation. He fights the fight of temptation, understanding that God is there standing with him to help him get through the temptation. The presence of God gives us strength. I need His presence. Little boy was carried by villagers to a hospital. The sad thing is that the hospital was far away and they had no transportation other than by foot. They carried him there to the hospital. The doctor told them that the little boy that he'd have to operate, but there was a problem. And so he asked, well, what's the problem? The doctor told the little boy and told his family, said, we have no anesthesia, but we must operate and we need to operate soon. Can you withstand the pain of the surgery? And the little boy said, if my mama's here to hold my hand, I can make it through. Well, let us remember and let us understand that there is strength in number. That Solomon said in the book of Ecclesiastes, 4, 2 are better than 1. For if one falls into the ditch, the other shall lift him up. Now, with God being omnipresent or being with us, we find strength to know that He's watching us in the midst of our trials. You know, a verse we've used before, 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 13, where Paul said, no temptation has taken you, but such as is common to man. God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted above what you are able, but will with temptation provide a way of escape, that you may be able to bear it. You see, God watches over us in the midst of temptation. He provides a way of escape, and He does that by checking the temperature. He sits, according to Malachi chapter 3, verse 3, as a refiner and purifier of silver. A refiner and purifier of silver is an individual that sits there and watches the crucible of silver in the midst of the fire to make sure it doesn't get too hot, but that it gets hot enough. God watches us in the midst of our temptation. And as He watches us and checks the temperature of the temptation, He tells us that He'll provide a way of escape. And so we're strengthened in knowing of the faithfulness of God. The psalmist in Psalm 9 and verse 10, for those who know your name. Now, it's interesting because if you go back, he says, those who know your name, Lord, and it's all capital letters, implying then the real name of God, the name Jehovah, will put their trust in you. Those who know you, those who know your name, will put their trust in you. And His presence will help get you through, will help strengthen you, will help hold you up in the midst of your trials and presence. Even though Satan is there, and even though Satan will throw whatever he desires at you, the presence of God and the fact that He's watching us, that He hears, that He'll carry us through our trials. He'll carry us through our difficulties. Story is told of a storm that wrecked a ship. There was only one survivor. He was a little boy. But the waves swept him up onto a rock, and early the next morning, the search party found him and rescued him. And so one of the rescuers asked him, said, well, did you tremble during the night when you were on the rock? And the little boy said, I surely did tremble, but, he said, the rock did not. God's our rock and our strength, a very present help in time of trouble. And in the midst of our temptation, the presence of God strengthens us in that He's going to help carry us through our trials. But then, I also think that the presence of God is reassuring for me, at least, because it fortifies me in my persecution. All that will live godly in Christ Jesus will suffer persecution, according to 2 Timothy 3, verse 12. But those of us that sit within the 21st century, those of us that sit in our chairs in our homes today and read that text, say, yes, but Paul wrote that to Timothy. in a time in which Christians were beaten for being Christians. Some of them were used by Nero and others to light their gardens at night. They were literally doused in oil and set on fire because really they were Christians. Others were imprisoned. Others were beaten because they were Christians. Others were crucified because they were Christians. Others were made sport of and thrown into a den of lions. And on we go and read of the early martyrs of biblical times and how they died. And we say, see, Paul was writing that to those people. They were persecuted at that time. But dear friends, even in the United States of America, as Christians are persecuted, we're made fun of. We're the brunt of jokes. We're basically stereotyped as being somewhat ignorant because we rely upon someone or something bigger than ourselves. We're excluded from things. And so thus we become persecuted. Maybe not the beatings of the lion's dens or the being used as human torches, but we're still persecuted. And we're persecuted for being Christians. We're persecuted because we believe what we believe and we want to stand with what we believe because the Bible teaches us to be bold, to be courageous, and to stand our ground. You see, it's not easy, is it, to live a life that's set apart for God. While He's called us by His gospel to the obtaining of glory, He's called us by His gospel to be separate and touch not the unclean things of the world. But that's not easy. As we said, it takes courage to take that stand. But it also takes strength and it takes fortitude. It takes knowing that God is present with us, that the Lord will help us through. Paul wrote to Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 17. He says, "For the Lord stood with me and strengthened me, so that the message might be preached fully through me, that all Gentiles might hear." The word Gentiles there just simply means all the world, all the people of the world. Paul says that the Lord stood with him and strengthened him while Paul was persecuted. While Paul talks about it in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, he talks about his maladies. He talks about how that he suffered shipwreck. He talked about how that he was beaten, how that he was thrown in prison. He talks about his difficulties that he went through and his persecution that he went through. And yet Paul was still able to write years later in 2 Timothy, "But the Lord stood with me." The Lord was there, but not only was He just there, but He was there in order to strengthen me. There's a great thought, isn't it? To think about the Lord is there to strengthen, Paul said. And Paul meant every word of it. You see, we might sit back and say, the presence of God, I just don't like that. I don't like the very presence of God, that He's always in my life. But yet, when I'm persecuted, I need someone to hold my hand. He's there. He's holding my hand. But then fourthly, I'm thankful for the presence of God because it motivates me in doing good. Christians are called to serve, aren't we? We're called to serve God and to serve Him with all of our being, to do the very best that we can in letting our light shine. Our service to God is a service wherein we not only serve God, but we serve our fellow man. And in serving our fellow man, we are serving God. The service that God calls us to is to do good, to be an individual that is involved in random acts of kindness, where we spread cheer and we spread hope and we spread help to those in need. You see, a Christian simply asks the question of himself, but also asks the question of those that he's around, what can I do to help? And he's motivated to do good and help others. He realizes that he cannot and does not need to do his bidding, if you will, in order to be seen of men. You know, there were those in Matthew chapter 6 that Jesus talked about there on the Sermon on the Mount that were praying. And there were those that were fasting. But they were doing those things not out of a sense of religious duty in order to get closer to God. But they were doing them out of a want for men to talk about how wonderfully marvelous and how wonderfully religious and righteous they were. And yet, Jesus said, it's not right. That you do not do your alms before men to be seen of them. Because he said there in Matthew chapter 6, verily I say unto you, they shall have their reward. And so he says, when you pray, enter into your closet. When you shut your door, pray to your Father which is in secret. Your Father which sees you in secret shall reward you openly. He said, do good, but you do good not for the praise of men, but you do good for God. You see, God is not unjust to forget your work and labor of love which you have shown toward His name, and that you've ministered to the saints. And you do minister, according to Hebrews chapter 6 and verse 10. God's promise of His presence says, okay, look, I'm watching what you're doing. I'm seeing what's going on with you. I realize what is taking place with you. And I want you to know that I'm watching not, if you will, to give you a sense of, well, here is a merit badge for doing something good, and here is a demerit badge for doing something that is not good. But it is God, simply put, saying, I'm watching you. And so we simply say, well, then I need to do what I'm supposed to do. My mother had an uncanny ability to find out whatever wrong I did. I don't know that. I think there was one time, matter of fact, I know there was one time that I got away with something that it wasn't until years later when all the family was sitting around, I think one Thanksgiving or Christmas, and I owned up to it. And I asked her, I said, did you know that? And she said no. And it was actually something where all of us boys in the neighborhood got in a little trouble, but it wasn't nothing that was insurmountable or that big of a problem. But my mother had this, as I said, had this uncanny ability to know when I had done something wrong, and because she found out about it. Well, I always wanted to do good because I didn't want to be in trouble, especially with her. And so I tried to live like she wanted me to, at least for the most part. And once in a while I slipped up. Who doesn't? Doesn't mean that it's right. But I was motivated by her seemingly omniscience, her knowledge of knowing my life, that I wanted to do good to make her pleased. God's presence helps us in that it motivates us to do good. It motivates us to do what's right. But then one more, we'll run through this very quickly, is found in Psalm 46. God's presence sustains me in trials. God's our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Who of us has not had trouble? Who of us has not had difficulties? Who of us has not had problems? But God and His presence gets us through, not only to be a refuge and strength, but follow along with me in Psalm 46, verse 2. Therefore, the psalmist says, and remember we've already said We talked about it Wednesday night. Therefore, let's see what the word therefore is there for. Therefore, we will not fear, even though the earth be removed, the mountains be carried in the midst of the sea, though its waters roar and be troubled, though the mountains shake with its swelling. There is a river whose stream shall be glad, the city of God, the holy place, the tabernacle of the Most High. God is in the midst of her, and she shall not be moved. God will help her just as at the break of dawn. The nations raged, the kingdoms were moved. He uttered his voice, the earth melted. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. Come, behold the works of the Lord, who has made desolation in the earth. He makes war cease to the ends of the earth. He breaks the bow and cuts the spear in two. He burns the chariot in fire. Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted above all the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. There the psalmist reminds us that when I'm in trouble and when life is in trouble, I have God to sustain me. I'm thankful. I don't know about you. I'm thankful for the presence of God. I know as a kid, when I sang that song, there's an all-seeing eye watching you. And I sort of had the idea, the image of that eyeball that's up in the sky that's watching me. But I thought of it with regards to terror. Oh, he's just waiting for me to mess up. He's just waiting for me to make a mistake. And the reality of it is that presence is not to look and point a finger at us and say, aha, I caught you. I caught you. I caught you. You're condemned to hell. But his presence is there to hold us up and to keep us going in the midst of life, both physically and spiritually. Thanks be to God for that all-seeing eye watching us. I hope that this will give you not just something to think about, but I hope that it will give you encouragement to know that God is watching for you, not just over you, but for you. We thank you for being with us tonight. We hope that you'll be able to be with us either in person or through the telephone Wednesday night. We'd love for you to be with us in person, but we know some can't, and that's fine. But we look forward to that time together. We're going to study out of Mark chapter 7. We're going to study the first 23 verses. We're going to talk about traditions. Until then, may God bless you and keep you is my prayer. Hope you have a great week. God bless.